V-22 Osprey, a product of nearly 30 years of designing, researching and testing. Part aircraft, part helicopter, the fast and agile Osprey is a revolutionary piece of engineering. Hi there, and welcome to our channel. Why don't you put your feet up and relax as we embark on a brand new adventure in the world of model building. The first thing that caught my eye was that the kit came in quite a large box. Sadly, there were no figurines inside. All of the parts were presented on 5 regular sprue frames and a 6th one which contained the clear parts. The clear parts were tinted, which seemed like a strange choice at first, but actually these looked great on the final model. I checked the rest of the parts and they were very well molded. I was a little disappointed at first, as most of the surface detail consisted of raised panel lines. Initially I had considered rescribing these, but eventually decided to try and build the model as is to see if those raised details would still look good on the finished model. That said, the parts were nicely detailed and there were only a few mold lines and tiny bits of flash on the parts. The decals were of a good quality and there were surprisingly few of them for a model this size. The instructions were laid out in easy to follow steps and had paint call outs for all the smaller parts along the way, which really helped the build to progress smoothly. The first step was to apply a black base coat to all the interior details. This included both the cockpit and cargo bay. The interior was given a coat of Tamiya XF25 light sea grey. The floor of the cargo bay and the loading ramp were masked off and I applied a coat of dark grey. I realized that none of this detail would be visible once the model was finished, but it seemed like the right thing to do. The pilot seats were painted light sea grey, after which the seat belts were detailed in red with silver buckles. The troop seats, which lined both sides of the cargo bay, were finished off in red and olive drab. I applied a dark wash to the pilot seats and the rest of the interior details. I carefully painted the small details of the instrument panel. Once done, I could assemble all of the interior parts of the aircraft. In order for the aircraft to be properly balanced, one needs to add 43 grams of lead ballast to the front part of the model. This was the first tricky part of the build, as a large amount of material had to be crammed into a relatively small space. After filling up all of the available space in the front of the aircraft, there was still a lot of unused ballast left over. Luckily, there was a bit more space underneath the cockpit, right next to the forward wheel bay. After using all of the space in the nose of the aircraft, I applied some canopy glue below the cockpit area and added the last of the lead ballast. Afterwards, it was time to start assembling the hull of the aircraft. To make things easier, the designers of the kit included various tabs and markings on the inside of the fuselage. Starting on the starboard side, I glued in the interior details and made sure they lined up and rested on these tabs before clamping them down. It's important to note that the model is fairly heavy, so it's a good idea to glue the wheelbase very securely if one intends to build the model with landing gear down. The first and second halves of the fuselage came together quite neatly, and the resulting seam line didn't require as much work as I'd feared. This time there were many pin nubs and pinholes along the edges to help align the two halves of the fuselage correctly, but also to add extra strength and support to the joint as it dried. I added some tape across the joint and allowed it to cure overnight. Although the canopy glass is tinted, it is still worthwhile to paint the cockpit details, as enough of them are clearly visible once the model has been completed. The Osprey is an insane feat of engineering. It has a maximum speed of 580 kilometers per hour, with an impressive range of 1,700 kilometers. It has a climb rate of 12 meters per second and a service ceiling of 7,600 meters. It has a capacity of up to 32 troops, or more than 9,000 kilograms of internal cargo. While the fuselage was drying, I put together the wing sub-assembly and let that dry overnight too. Optionally, the nacelles of the tilt rotor engines can be built in either a horizontal or vertical position. I built them vertically as I wanted to display the finished model gear down in a landed position. Next, the tires were base coated and painted. The canopy masks were very complicated, as there were a lot of small sections which needed to be masked separately. Initially, I used flexible masking tape which would follow the curved parts easily, and applied some masking fluid afterwards. However, I think I stretched the tape a bit too much as it slowly started shrinking and losing shape. Eventually, I replaced most of this with regular masking tape. When I removed the supporting tape from the fuselage, I could see that there was quite a large ragged seam line along the joint. This was to be expected, as the two model kit parts which made up the bulk of the fuselage were very big, and the line where they joined ran straight through the center of the model. Unfortunately, the seam line meant that a lot of sanding and filling had to be done. This resulted in the loss of some of those raised panel lines. Luckily, there wasn't too much detail in these areas, and I was careful not to be overzealous with my elbow grease. I applied some putty to the seam lines, as there were a few gaps which needed to be taken care of. Once again, these were sanded carefully and sparingly until the seam line was almost invisible. The tail and wing sections were glued on carefully. This was probably the last time I would ever get to see the cargo hold. There were some large gaps where the wings met the fuselage, which were filled with putty and carefully sanded smooth. The Osprey has 3 flight modes: helicopter or VTOL mode, where the nacelles are vertical and the props horizontal; airplane or fixed wing mode, where the nacelles are horizontal and the props are vertical; and conversion mode, where the nacelles were somewhere in between for rolling takeoff and landing. The 2 composite rotors were built and painted separately from the rest of the model, and only added right at the end of the build. I decided to paint the rotor markings instead of using the decals provided by the kit. This would look a lot more realistic and probably be easier to do anyway. After a base coat, I applied a coat of flat white paint. The bits which needed to remain white were masked off, after which I masked off the rest of the rotor in preparation for the red paint. A quick application of flat red and it was almost done. Once the paint was dry, the red stripe was masked off and I applied a coat of black paint. At this point, all of the masks could be removed and I touched up some areas where the paint had bled underneath. The last step was to mask off and paint the silver detail on the leading edge of the rotors. Once these masks were removed, the rotors were done and ready for final assembly. Before painting, I decided to do some pre-shading of the panel lines with some flat black paint. This allowed me to pick out a lot of the prominent details, but it also allowed me to create some artificial details where the raised panel details were lost during the sanding process. At this stage, the engine nacelles were pre-shaded and painted separately. Unfortunately, the Osprey needs to be painted in dark and light ghost grey, and Tamiya does not have equivalent colours in their airbrush range. Due to the way things are in the world at the moment, I could not get hold of any ghost grey in another range of paints either, so I experimented and mixed various colour combinations until I found a formula which seemed close enough, but still I wasn't happy. Luckily, our local hobby store carried ghost grey in Tamiya spray cans, which I eventually decanted and used in the airbrush. I applied the light ghost grey first to the lower hull, being careful not to obscure the pre-shading completely. This process was repeated for the lower part of the engine housings. Similarly, the upper part of the Osprey received a few light coats of dark ghost grey, as did the engine nacelles. After painting, the nacelles were glued into place on the wings. The next step was to apply a coat of gloss varnish in order to add the decals. As a precaution, I used a micro mesh cloth to polish the surface and remove any dust and paint particles. The decals were of an excellent quality and were very easy to apply. I added some setting solution to allow the decals to soften and conform to the shape of the model. This step is always a little unnerving, as the decals appear to be completely ruined by this action. But once dry, they settle so perfectly that it's almost as if they were painted on. I applied another coat of gloss varnish to seal in the decals, and then a coat of matte varnish to remove the shine from the gloss varnish. At this point, it was time to remove the canopy masks. This should always be done very slowly in order to avoid chipping the paint in the areas next to the masks. Luckily, no paint bled under the masks and they all came off smoothly and cleanly. As a final step, I applied a brown filter all over the surface of the aircraft. To make the filter, I used Army Painter Quick Shade Light Tone. I mixed 1 part of this to 3 parts of water and applied it in several layers in an attempt to blend the colors of the model and make them look more natural. After a bit more weathering and gluing on the fiddly bits, I called her done. She came together beautifully and the raised panel lines actually looked quite good. To be honest, the raised rivets looked more natural than the little holes which are used for models with recessed panel details. This truly was an excellent model kit from Italeri of the V-22 Osprey, one of the most magnificent machines ever to grace the skies. So long, and thanks for watching.